a suitcase filled with silence. But silence can scream. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your voices make this journey unforgettable. Now, let's begin the mystery. It was one of those raw December mornings in Baker Street when the very air seemed to cling with a damp chill, and the fog had rolled in so thickly that the gaslights appeared to float in amber globes above the pavement. I had risen early and was sipping my second cup of tea when Holmes, who had not yet touched the breakfast Mrs. Hudson had laid out, suddenly snapped his fingers and muttered something about cornflour residue on an English walnut shell. This cryptic remark was delivered without preamble, and I knew better than to ask for an explanation. Holmes was seated cross-legged on the floor before the fireplace, eyes narrowed, fingers steepled beneath his chin, a sure sign he was unraveling something in his mind that others had overlooked. Our morning's quiet was soon interrupted by a knock at the door. 3 crisp raps, hesitant yet urgent. Mrs. Hudson showed in a man of perhaps 45 years, trimly dressed in a travel-stained overcoat and clutching a leather valise, which he refused to relinquish, even when she offered to hang it up. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the man asked, his voice low but firm, eyes darting between Holmes and myself. Holmes rose, brushing imaginary dust from his knees. "I am he. And you, sir, have travelled from Truro by the 6:15 express, taken a hansom from Paddington, and are a solicitor of some repute, judging by the monogrammed blotting ink on your cuff and the burnished brass fittings on your briefcase." The man blinked. "You're correct on all counts. My name is Percival March. I practice law in Cornwall, though I do not believe we have ever corresponded." Holmes gestured to a chair, "And yet here you are, bearing something of peculiar concern. Pray, do sit down, Mr. March. Dr. Watson and I are entirely at your disposal." March sat stiffly, setting the valise on his lap like a lifeline. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've come to you with a matter that I can hardly believe myself, and yet I witnessed it. I'm executor to the estate of Lady Margaret Deering, who passed away last month in our parish of St. Austell. She died peacefully, and her affairs seemed in good order. However," he paused, fidgeting with the brass latch of the valise. "Last Thursday, her nephew, Mr. Lionel Deering, came to collect some of her personal effects before the reading of the will. I had prepared a few items in a locked trunk, mostly heirlooms, but there was one oddity, a battered brown suitcase she kept under her bed. We had assumed it was empty, until we heard the noise." "The noise?" I echoed. March nodded gravely. "A sound, Dr. Watson, as if something or someone had stirred inside. Faint, muffled. We opened it immediately, but it was empty." Holmes leaned forward. "Empty, you say?" "Utterly. No lining, no false bottom, nothing. Just the musty smell of lavender and, if I may say, an uncanny silence, almost too complete." "A silence," Holmes echoed, eyes narrowing. "Yes, as if all sound had fled from it. I cannot explain it, but Lionel and I both felt it. Something was wrong. He laughed it off, but since then, strange things have occurred. His dog won't go near the case, and yesterday his housemaid vanished without a trace." Holmes stood abruptly, his eyes gleaming. "A curious trifecta. A suitcase that makes a sound, though nothing's in it, a silence that feels like a presence, and now, disappearance." March set the valise down between us. "I brought it with me. I hesitated, of course, but I couldn't leave it there. You must see for yourself." Holmes crouched before the case and lifted the lid. We peered inside. As March had said, empty, and then, just faintly, like the far-off rustle of pages in a closed library, there it was, a whisper, not from without, but from within. Holmes did not flinch, but I felt a cold prickle run up my spine. "Well," Holmes said quietly, his eyes locked on the suitcase's interior, "that is most instructive." Holmes remained crouched beside the open suitcase, his gaze fixed not on its interior, but just above it, as if studying the air itself. The moment was peculiarly charged. An unnatural stillness settled over the room, as though the suitcase had drawn in even the ambient sounds of Baker Street. The distant clatter of a carriage in the street below seemed suddenly more distant, muffled by something neither physical nor explainable. Holmes's lips parted, not in wonder, but in calculation. "It is not the presence of sound, Watson," he murmured, "but its precise absence that fascinates me. Would you agree, Mr. March, that the noise you heard prior to opening this item did not resemble a mechanical click or a shifting weight, but rather something organic?" March nodded, fingers gripping his knees. "Yes, though it lasted barely more than a second. Like breath caught in linen. I would have dismissed it as the wind, had it not come from directly within the suitcase." Holmes reached into the case, not with caution, but with the steady hand of a surgeon, and traced the seams of the interior lining. "No false panels," he muttered. "No hidden compartments. And yet—" His fingers paused, then tapped lightly on the base. A dull sound. He repeated the motion across different areas, each thud returning uniformly. Nothing hollow, no acoustic anomaly. "I should like to keep this suitcase for observation," Holmes said at last, rising. "It offends my reason, and that is reason enough to subject it to a more rigorous examination." "Of course," March replied quickly, standing as well. "Though I feel compelled to warn you, Mr. Holmes. My client's household has changed since this object arrived. Lady Margaret's residence is now under Lionel's care, and though he scoffs at superstition, the staff are disturbed. There's talk of it being cursed." Watson snorted involuntarily, but Holmes raised a finger, not in rebuke, but in thought. "Curses are only dangerous when believed in, but belief itself is a most dangerous thing. Tell me, did the vanished maid— what was her name?" "Beatrice Tilling," said March. "She had worked for the family 3 years, no cause for alarm in her past, and yet she vanished the night after the suitcase was opened. Her room was found undisturbed. Bed neatly made, belongings intact, but her apron was hung on the stair banister and the front door was unlatched. There were no signs of struggle." Holmes turned toward me. "Watson, make a note. The door was unlatched. That suggests she left of her own volition or was made to appear to." March cleared his throat. "There's more. A note was found in the drawing-room fireplace, only partially burned. It bore a single line in pencil. 'The silence is not empty.'" Holmes's eyebrows rose and his smile returned faintly, an expression I'd come to associate with the birth of a theory. "And yet, Mr. March, you told me you do not believe in supernatural explanations." "I don't," March replied, looking almost apologetic, "but I cannot deny what I've witnessed, which is why I've come to you." Holmes gave a satisfied nod and turned briskly toward the fireplace. "Then we must not delay. Watson, pack your bag. We are going to Cornwall." "But what do you expect to find there?" I asked, already reaching for my coat despite the uncertainty. Holmes lifted the suitcase and handed it to me. It felt lighter than it should have, an odd thing considering the weight of implication it carried. "I expect," he said, "to find silence explained." The journey to Cornwall was undertaken that very afternoon, and the train ride was largely silent. Oddly so, for Holmes had taken to one of his rare introspective moods, wherein his attention seemed to detach from the surroundings entirely. Once, he scribbled something in his notebook, 3 words, diagonally across the page: hollow, motive, resonance. When I attempted to ask what they signified, he waved the question aside and returned to staring out the window as rain streaked down the glass. It was past 9 in the evening when we arrived at the Deering estate on the edge of St. Austell, a gabled stone house perched above a slope of frost-bitten garden, its silhouette stern against the night sky. A single lantern burned near the entrance, casting a wan light over the stoop. As we approached, The door opened to reveal a tall man in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his face worn but composed. "Mr. Holmes, I presume? I am Lionel Deering." Holmes bowed politely. "And this is Dr. Watson, my colleague and chronicler. Might we impose upon your hospitality for the evening? We understand the suitcase originated here." Deering gave a half smile. "I never thought I'd summon a consulting detective over a piece of luggage, but the events of the past few days have been unusual. You are welcome, gentlemen." We were shown into the drawing room, a richly panelled space with a marble hearth and an array of framed watercolors on the wall, none of which, I noted, featured people. A stiff fire burned behind the grate, though its warmth did little to banish the chill that seemed embedded in the walls. "The suitcase," Deering said, nodding toward the case Holmes had placed on the ottoman, "was found under my aunt's bed. No one had touched it in years, and yet the night we opened it—" He stopped, shook his head. I felt as though something had left the room. Not entered. Left. That's what unsettled me. Holmes examined the bookshelves along the far wall without answering. Then, turning to Deering, "You say you never opened it before your aunt's death?" "Never. She was a private woman, kept many of her things stored away, locked drawers and such. And this Beatrice Tilling, the maid, what do you make of her disappearance?" "She was a sensible girl," Deering said, pouring himself a brandy. "Hard-working, not given to fits or fancy. And yet, 2 nights after that sound from the suitcase, she was gone." Holmes accepted the drink but did not sip. Instead, he turned to the fireplace. The partially burned note? Deering moved to a drawer in a writing desk and produced a charred scrap folded into a sheet of blotting paper. Holmes held it to the light. The pencil line remained faint but legible. "The silence is not empty." Holmes considered this a moment, then reached into the suitcase and laid the scrap inside. Nothing happened. No sound, no change in pressure or atmosphere. "Do you believe in residual impressions, Mr. Deering?" Holmes asked. "Like ghosts? Like memory. Objects sometimes retain impressions, not of spirits, but of actions. Pressure, force, heat. A suitcase, long sealed, may not whisper with supernatural agency, but with the weight of something that once was." Deering frowned. "But the sound?" "Yes. A breath, you said. Not yours. Not mine. The suitcase does not whisper. It echoed." There was a silence after this that none of us interrupted. Holmes finally placed the suitcase before the hearth, where it stood like a patient, mute conspirator. He turned to me suddenly. "Watson, you noticed the portraits?" "There are none." "Exactly. A house full of history, and not a single face. Why?" "Lady Margaret disliked being watched," Lionel offered. "She often said eyes trapped stories." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Curious phrasing. Mr. Deering, tomorrow I should like to see Lady Margaret's bedchamber and more. Importantly, her writing desk. There is something in this house that is not quite right, and I do not believe it resides in that suitcase." "Not truly." "Of course," Deering said, visibly unsettled. "You shall have access to whatever you require." Holmes nodded. "Good. Because the silence, I believe, is not only not empty, it is deliberate." And with that, Holmes turned back toward the suitcase and sat before it, fingers steepled once more, eyes reflecting the flickering firelight as if reading secrets in the shadows. The morning broke gray and brittle, the sort of December light that barely pushed past the curtains and left rooms suspended in a permanent half-shadow. Holmes rose early, as I knew he would, and had already been up for some time when I entered the breakfast room. He stood at the far window, unmoving, gazing across the frost-covered lawn as if the grass itself might confess something. "You slept poorly," he remarked, without turning. "The fire had burned too low when you retired, and I heard your boots scrape across the floor twice in the early hours. Bad dreams?" "No," I replied, seating myself and lifting the silver dome from my plate. "Just a curious mind and a head full of unanswered questions." Holmes nodded, satisfied. Then we are alike in that. Lionel Deering has not left his rooms this morning. That is telling. You suspect him? I asked. I suspect silence, Holmes replied simply. Let us see where it leads. He requested the housekeeper escort us to Lady Margaret's bedchamber, a task she did with no enthusiasm. The room was on the second floor facing east, with thick velvet drapes still drawn across the windows. Holmes insisted on leaving them closed. We're not here to see what daylight shows, he said. We are here to see what it conceals. The chamber was austere but unmistakably feminine. Carved headboard, faded floral wallpaper, a single shelf of books, and the writing desk Holmes had mentioned the night before. He moved first to the bed, crouching beside it. This is where the suitcase was found? The housekeeper nodded. Tucked underneath, sir, covered in dust until Mr. Deering pulled it out. Holmes examined the floorboards under the bed, running his fingers along the gaps. Then he stood abruptly and moved to the desk. I joined him. The desk was neat, almost obsessively so. An inkstand, a stack of cream stationery, a letter opener in the shape of a swan. Holmes opened each drawer in turn, carefully and without haste. In the third drawer, tucked beneath a layer of pressed lavender, he found what he was looking for. Ah, he murmured, holding up a small bound diary. He opened it, scanning the pages quickly. Most were filled with mundane reflections, weather, minor ailments, worries about the garden staff. But his eyes lingered on an entry dated 3 weeks before Lady Margaret's death. Lionel visited today. He asked again about the suitcase. I told him it was not to be opened, not until I was gone, and even then only if truly necessary. There are things better left unsaid. Silence at times is a form of protection. Holmes looked up. Interesting phrasing. She feared what was inside, I asked, or what it represented. People rarely fear objects themselves, Watson. They fear consequences. He closed the diary and slipped it into his coat. We turned to the bookshelf next, thin volumes of poetry, prayer books, and one curious monograph entitled The Acoustics of Memory by a doctor, Phineas Culverwell. Holmes opened it, examined the inside cover, and chuckled softly. Published privately in 1874. Now here is something. The book discussed in unusually poetic scientific language the idea that certain sounds, especially traumatic or intensely emotional ones, might be imprinted into physical surroundings under the right conditions. Stone, wood, even fabric, the author claimed, could act as accidental recording devices, holding a sort of echo. There were references to ancient tombs where cries had been heard centuries after they were uttered, to tapestries in abbeys that gave off sighs. Pseudo-scientific nonsense, surely, I muttered. Possibly, Holmes agreed. But when a scientific hypothesis, however spurious, aligns with real observation, it demands attention. He tucked the book under his arm and left the room abruptly. I followed him down the hall and out into the garden. The frost had begun to melt, making the gravel path slick. Holmes headed not toward the lawn, but to a small outbuilding at the garden's edge, a former potting shed, now converted into a storage room. He stopped at the door and knocked, then opened it without waiting. Inside was the suitcase. It had been moved. Holmes glanced around. Mr. Deering said nothing of having it relocated. Curious, is it not, Watson, how frequently people move the very thing they claim not to believe in? He crouched beside it and ran his hands over the sides again. Then he did something I did not expect. He placed his ear against the leather and sat completely still. The silence returned. I felt it rather than heard it, an oppressive muteness that seemed to press against the eardrums. My heartbeat sounded unnaturally loud in my chest. A trick of acoustics, perhaps, or suggestion, but it was undeniable. Holmes straightened. It is not the suitcase that is remarkable, he said. It is the silence itself, the absence. And yet I now believe this object was never meant to contain something. It was meant to mask something. Mask, I repeated. He pointed to the shed walls. This building, enclosed, dry, thick walls. Think, Watson, if you wanted to conceal the origin of a sound, if you feared someone might hear, it would not be enough to hush the source. You would need something to absorb, the resonance. A void within a void. He turned back to the suitcase and began tapping its seams more forcefully. Give me your penknife. I handed it over without question. Holmes inserted the blade under the interior lining, working it gently. Then, with a sharp rip, the base of the suitcase came away, not to reveal a hidden compartment, but rather a layer of tightly packed wool and cork, carefully constructed insulation. Beneath it, a square of thin iron plate, dark with oxidation and age. "Ah," Holmes whispered. "Watson, fetch Mr. Deering." I ran back to the house, found Lionel in the front hall, and returned with him to the shed. His face paled when he saw the opened base. I didn't know that was there," he said. "No," Holmes asked lightly. "And yet you came searching for something, did you not? After your aunt's death?" Lionel stiffened. "I was looking for documents. Her will was simple, but she often wrote letters she never sent. I thought perhaps—" "You thought perhaps something had been hidden in the suitcase," Holmes finished for him. "But you found only silence. Because the suitcase was not a hiding place. It was a filter, a sound dampener." He reached down and tapped the iron plate with the butt of his penknife. The sound was faint, nearly absent. This was built to trap noise, or more precisely, to keep noise from escaping. Deering swallowed. But what could she have wanted to silence? Holmes stood. "That, Mr. Deering, is the question I now intend to answer, and I believe your vanished maid may be part of that answer." He turned to me. "Watson, we must speak to the rest of the staff. I want to know everything Beatrice Tilling said or did in her final days, especially anything she might have heard." Deering's expression grew more troubled. "There is one thing I didn't mention yesterday. The night before she vanished, she told the cook she could hear music." "Music?" Holmes repeated sharply. "A single note, like a violin's open string. Low, constant, but only when she stood near the shed." Holmes stared at the suitcase again. So the silence was hiding sound. Not ghosts, not voices, but music. He stepped outside, the cold wind catching the edge of his coat. "And music," he said under his breath, "is never accidental." We followed him back to the house, unaware then how far the melody would reach and what truth it had been woven to conceal. Holmes wasted no time once we returned to the house. He summoned the remaining staff to the drawing room and began questioning each with a methodical precision that I had seen unsettle more hardened men than these simple country servants. He asked no leading questions, allowed no drift into speculation. He wanted facts, moments, words, nothing more. The housekeeper, the cook, the scullery maid, even the gardener's boy were made to recall everything they could about Beatrice Tilling in the days before her disappearance. "She was quiet," said the cook, a ruddy-cheeked woman with nervous hands, "but never moody. She'd hum while folding the linens, little tunes to herself." "What sort of tunes?" Holmes asked, without looking up from his notebook. "Just soft things, like nursery rhymes," she said. "But the last few days, well, she stopped humming, looked pale. One morning I found her just standing in the hall, frozen stiff. I asked what was wrong, and she said, 'There's a sound in the walls, like someone is playing a note that doesn't stop.'" Holmes looked up sharply. "The walls?" She did not say outside. "No, sir. She said she heard it mostly in the hall outside the east guest room." "Where is that in relation to the shed?" "Just above it, sir." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. He dismissed the staff gently and asked Lionel to have no one enter the east guest room until he'd completed his inspection. As we climbed the stairs once more, I could feel Holmes's thoughts accelerating, fitting pieces together, though the overall shape remained maddeningly obscure. The east guest room had not been used in years. Dust gathered in the corners, and the hearth was cold. Holmes moved immediately to the far wall which faced the garden, and ran his hands along the skirting board, then up the plastered wall itself. He stopped at shoulder height, pressed his ear against it, then stepped back. "Watson, the suitcase was not the source of the sound," he said softly. "It was the conduit, placed there to suppress what this house was unwilling to admit." He tapped the wall twice. A muffled thud responded. "Hollow behind here." "There's no adjoining room on the other side," I said, thinking aloud. "The house ends there. It must be the outer wall." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "But do you recall what Deering told us? His aunt warned him never to open the suitcase unless necessary. She left the object not as a puzzle, but as a barrier." He stepped back again and began pacing the room, measuring out paces with his cane from the wall to the far window. Then, almost casually, he turned to the hearth and knelt before it. The fireplace was narrow, long cold, and filled with the residue of past winters. Holmes thrust his hand deep into the ash, then withdrew it, his fingers blackened, his face impassive. "No soot above a certain point," he said. "The chimney does not go up as far as it ought. Watson, fetch me that candle." I did as asked. Holmes lit the taper and held it just inside the flue. The flame did not flicker, not a breath of draught. As I thought, this fireplace has been sealed or diverted. At once he began probing along the back of the hearth with the point of his cane, until there was a sharp click. A section of stone no broader than a shoebox gave way and swung open, revealing a narrow vertical shaft behind the hearth, descending into darkness. We stared. Holmes leaned in and took a long sniff of the air. Old metal, damp wood, and something else. "Oil," he looked at me grimly. "Stay here." "Holmes?" But he was already gone, vanishing from the room and thundering down the stairs. I followed after him with more caution and found him outside within minutes, striding toward the base of the house's exterior, where the east wall met the slope of the garden. He stopped at a point directly below the sealed fireplace and knelt. "Here," he said, brushing leaves aside. Beneath the brush was a flat stone slab, slightly uneven. A discolored iron hinge jutted out on one side. "A trapdoor," I breathed. "Precisely." He produced a thin folding blade and worked it under the edge. The stone lid groaned as he raised it, revealing a wooden staircase descending into darkness. I held the lantern aloft as Holmes descended first. The narrow staircase led not to a wine cellar or root room, as one might expect, but to a small, carefully constructed underground chamber. It was utterly silent. The walls were lined with thick wood panels and more of the same iron plating we had seen in the suitcase. On one side stood a narrow table upon which lay a violin, its strings snapped, the bow broken in half beside it. Next to it, stacked neatly, were a series of papers. Sheet music, though the notation was unlike any I'd seen. Holmes picked one up, studying it closely. "These are not melodies," he said. "These are tones, repetitions. Look at the markings. Quarter notes, half notes, single strings. It's a harmonic pattern, designed for resonance." He turned to the back wall where a rusted bracket held a long, thin metal tube, perhaps 6 feet in length. It curved up into the stone above. Holmes tapped it gently. From far above, faintly, we heard a ping echo. "The chimney shaft was hollowed to carry sound, Watson. Not smoke. Sound. This is an acoustic chamber." "But why? For what purpose?" Holmes answered slowly, carefully. "To transmit a tone, one designed not to be heard clearly, but to affect. A frequency just below perception, enough to unsettle, to disturb. Lady Margaret, she didn't merely fear sound. She feared what it could do. But to what end?" He turned to me. I suspect we will soon discover that. But first, we must speak again with Mr. Deering. Back in the drawing room, Lionel awaited us, sipping brandy once more. He looked up, startled by our grim expressions. "You've found something," he said. Holmes didn't speak for a moment. Then, placing the broken violin on the table, he said, "Mr. Deering, what do you know about your aunt's brother?" Lionel blinked. "Her brother, Uncle Giles. He died young, before I was born. Drowned, I believe. Did she ever speak of him?" "Number only. That he was delicate. That's the word she used." Holmes nodded. "Then I must tell you what your family buried, what Lady Margaret spent her life guarding." And he began to explain. The sealed room, the soundproofing, the frequency tone. "Your aunt was not concealing a thing," Holmes concluded, "but an effect. Something your uncle discovered, an accidental resonance, perhaps, that disturbed the mind. Maybe through his music, or perhaps something more intentional. Either way, your aunt imprisoned it, kept it isolated. She buried the sound itself." Deering was pale. "And now?" "Now someone has disturbed that isolation," Holmes said quietly. The suitcase moved. The sound was released. Beatrice, perhaps sensitive to it, heard it clearest. And if the tone was never neutral to begin with, its influence may have drawn her somewhere, or driven her away. "Driven?" I echoed. "You believe she fled, or was lured? Sound affects more than hearing. It affects behavior. We must locate her, and quickly." Holmes rose, his eyes gleaming now, not with triumph, but with resolve. "Tonight, Watson, we return to the shed. The music may yet be playing." He turned toward the window. Beyond the frosted glass, the wind stirred faintly across the lawn, but the silence pressed back. That evening brought with it a damp, creeping mist that settled over the Deering estate like a veil. Even the trees seemed subdued beneath it, their skeletal limbs blurred and drooping. Holmes was in a state of sharpened calm, a state I had long since learned to identify not as peace, but as the hush before decisive action. He moved quickly through the corridors, gathering tools, a length of cord, a small lantern with a shutter, a glass vial, and, oddly, a tuning fork, which he slipped into his coat pocket without comment. By 9:30, we stood again outside the potting shed, the frost from earlier now a sheen of wetness on the earth. Holmes paused at the threshold and inhaled. "The air is different tonight," he said. "Thicker, almost tuned." I frowned. "Tuned?" He shook his head. "No time to explain fully. But sound changes air. Not only in vibration, there are sympathetic responses in moisture, density, even temperature. If this place has been radiating a tone, however faint, then the air may be part of the delivery system." Inside, the suitcase remained where we had left it, though something in its presence now felt heavier, more immediate. Holmes moved past it and examined the far wall of the shed. He paced from one end to the other, tapped a knothole, then the floorboards. "Do you hear that?" he asked suddenly. I listened. For a moment, nothing. Then, very faintly, a vibration, no more than a murmur below hearing, like pressure building behind the ears. "It's not constant," Holmes whispered. "It pulses, roughly every 30 seconds. What causes it?" He dropped to his knees, pressed his ear to the ground. "It's coming from beneath. Possibly the transmission tube we discovered earlier, still active. Either a residual tone is being sustained by a mechanism, or someone has restarted it deliberately." He rose abruptly. "Watson, stay here. If it increases in pitch, leave immediately. Do not speak. Do not call out. Just go." "Where are you going?" I asked. "To the attic." "But you said the mechanism was underground." Holmes paused at the door. "Yes, which is why it's all the more curious that the resonance is strongest at the top of the house." With that, he vanished into the dark. Left alone, I stood still, listening. The silence in the shed was deceptive. It wasn't true stillness. There was the same pressing absence I had felt before, as though something should be heard but wasn't. The kind of silence that demands listening. And then it returned. A tone, barely perceptible. A hum so low and constant it could have been dismissed as imagination. But it was real. My skin prickled. The sound didn't come from the suitcase this time. It came from the very structure of the shed. The lantern flickered. I turned slowly. Nothing moved. And yet I felt a shift. The air was colder. No breeze, no source, just colder. I thought of Beatrice, standing here, hearing the sound, feeling the pull. Then I heard it, a footstep. Not mine. Holmes. I stepped to the door, opened it quickly. Nothing. And yet, there, just at the edge of the misted garden path, a shape. A woman's figure, slight, no cloak, bare arms. Miss Tilling? I called softly. The figure turned, not startled. Just slow, almost entranced. Miss Tilling, it's Dr. Watson. We've been looking for you. She stepped backward into the mist. Wait! I followed, hurrying after her through the garden. The path curved, dipped. The mist grew denser. I saw her again, further ahead now, walking steadily toward the line of trees that marked the estate's rear boundary. Miss Tilling, you must stop. It's not safe. Another few steps, and I lost her completely. The fog swallowed everything. Then, suddenly, an arm reached out and stopped me. Watson. It was Holmes, breathless, his hair damp, face set. You saw her. Yes. She was just there. Tilling, she went toward the woods. No, he said firmly. You saw what she was meant to see. Come. He pulled me back the way I had come, quickly, and we returned to the house. Once inside, Holmes bolted the door and turned to Lionel Deering, who had appeared in the hallway, pale with confusion. She's been seen, Holmes said flatly. Beatrice? Deering asked. Alive? Unclear. What I saw was a manifestation. Possibly her, possibly not, but it leads me to believe that this tone, this resonance, it is not simply sound. It is suggestion, influence, a directed psychological instrument. Directed by whom? I asked. Holmes turned to Lionel. That, Mr. Deering, is what we must ask you. I need you to think carefully. Who, aside from yourself and your aunt, knew of the suitcase's existence? Or more importantly, who might have known of the chamber beneath the east guest room? Deering looked stunned. No one. It was her private space. She never discussed it. I only found mention of it in a marginal note in her gardening ledger. I wouldn't have known otherwise. Holmes narrowed his eyes. The violin downstairs. Its strings were cut recently. The bow broken. Yet the room had not been entered in years. That means someone has been down there in recent weeks. Someone with access. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway, hesitant. Mr. Holmes, forgive the interruption. There's a man at the back gate. Claims to be the groundskeeper from 3 years ago. Said he used to work for Lady Margaret. Name of Felix Moore. Holmes stiffened. Show him in. Moments later, the man entered. A lean, middle-aged fellow with a wind-chapped face and a wary eye. He clutched his cap in both hands. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I heard through the vicar's boy that the Deering place was stirring again. Thought it time I came forward. About what, Mr. Moore? Holmes asked quietly. He licked his lips. About what I heard. About what I helped build. We said nothing. Holmes gestured for him to sit. I was hired special by Lady Margaret some 15 years back. Not as a gardener, but as a joiner. She wanted a sealed space made beneath the east wing. Told me it was for archives, rare books, nothing more. But the work was strange. She had measurements drawn to exact specifications, had me line the walls with odd materials. Steel mesh, corkboard, then iron sheeting. All imported, said the acoustics had to be precise. Did you ever hear anything from within the chamber? Holmes asked. Moore nodded. Once, during construction. Thought it was a tuning fork left on the table. But it went on too long. I asked her about it. She said it was the past, trying to speak. Holmes pressed on. Have you returned to the property recently? 2 weeks ago, Moore admitted. I saw the house was still shuttered. I went to the shed. Don't know why. Habit. But I heard something. Low. Like the old days. It frightened me. I left. Holmes nodded slowly. Then the mechanism is autonomous, or perhaps something reactivated by presence alone. He stood, turning to us both. There is something down there still active. Some vibration, some pattern repeating in secret. It must be dismantled. Deering spoke up. You said the sound influences the mind, that it draws people. Holmes looked at him sharply. Yes. Then, what happens if it's not just drawing the living? There was a moment's silence at that. Holmes gave no answer, but I saw his jaw clench ever so slightly, not in fear, but in urgency. We return to the chamber, he said. Tonight. And so it was that once again we descended into the hidden passage, this time not with discovery in mind, but confrontation. Holmes with his instruments, myself with a revolver at my side, though I scarcely knew what I expected to fire upon. The air was cold, motionless, but not empty. Not anymore. Holmes struck the tuning fork and held it near the iron wall. The note it gave was high, clear, and was answered faintly by a lower tone within the chamber. He smiled grimly. There it is. Still singing. Then he began dismantling the apparatus. We worked by flickering lantern light as the hum pulsed around us like breath in the dark. The lantern's flame wavered in the stillness as Holmes crouched before the narrow shelf holding the rusted violin and its ruined bow. His fingers moved with meticulous care, removing the warped sheet music and setting each page aside in a strict sequence. I held the lantern high, its flickering glow casting elongated shadows that danced across the iron-lined walls, shadows that seemed to retreat from the edges of Holmes's focus. You'll observe, Holmes said, his voice unnaturally calm beneath the persistent background hum, that the metal tubing here, this transmission conduit, has been placed with such precision that even a minor disruption in its pitch would render it ineffective. This is no accident. Someone with detailed knowledge of acoustics designed this chamber, and they did so for a singular purpose, to produce a continuous tone of influence. A tone, I murmured, that affects the mind? Holmes nodded, not looking up. Much like the subtle notes used in ancient rituals, or the precise frequencies that can loosen mortar from stone. Sound is power, Watson. It acts upon us whether we acknowledge it or not. He turned his attention to the brackets supporting the iron tube and reached for the glass vial he had brought. Mercuric nitrate, he said, holding it up to the light. Corrosive to oxidized metals. Stand back. With practiced caution, he applied a thin line of the liquid to the bracket's base. A soft hiss rose as the fluid reacted with the rusted fittings, and after a moment, Holmes struck the metal gently with his tuning fork. The low tone shivered in the air, then broke, distorted, its harmony fractured. There, Holmes whispered. The loop is cracked. A noticeable shift followed. The ambient pressure, impossible to define but always present, seemed to loosen, like a knot gently untying inside one's skull. The hum did not vanish, but it faltered, and with that faltering came something new. Silence. True silence, not the oppressive kind we had experienced before, but an absence, clean and freeing. Holmes stood and brushed his hands. Clean. That's it, I asked, my voice hushed. It's over? No, he said, eyes narrowing. But the mechanism is neutralized. The resonance has lost its integrity. What remains now is only psychological residue, the echo of suggestion. He paused, as if choosing his next words with care. But echoes can be dangerous when confused for voices. I looked again at the ruined violin and the scattered pages of notation. Do you believe her brother created this, the uncle no one spoke of? I do, Holmes said. He may not have understood its full impact, but he discovered something. An accidental frequency, perhaps, when experimenting with string harmonics. Your mind latches onto it. It draws attention not like a shout, but like a whisper you almost hear. And Lady Margaret sealed it away. She recognized its danger, perhaps not scientifically, but instinctively. She concealed it, isolated it, but never destroyed it. Why not? Holmes gave a faint shrug. Perhaps she hoped one day someone would understand it properly. Or perhaps, like so many who protect secrets, she feared the cost of erasure. We gathered the materials, sheet music, tuning forks, the remains of the instrument, and ascended in silence. The night above had grown still. The mist had lifted. The house was quiet, its tension uncoiled. In the hall we found Lionel Deering waiting, his coat on, one hand gripping the banister as though expecting a verdict. Holmes handed him the pages. Your aunt was not mad, he said. She was cautious. She safeguarded something few would believe, an acoustic effect so subtle it could not be seen, but so invasive it could alter thought. You've inherited her house. Now you must also decide what to do with her legacy. Deering looked at the pages as though they might burst into flame. I'll have the room sealed, properly this time. Brick, not boards. Nothing will come out again. Holmes made no argument. He only nodded. Good. But first, one more thing. He turned toward the front parlor and gestured for me to follow. We entered the cold room where we had first inspected the suitcase. It remained where we had left it, still and silent. Holmes approached it once more, opened the lid, and reached down to the false base. From within the lining, he drew out a folded piece of paper we had missed before, perhaps dislodged by our earlier examination. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was sharp, cramped. If this is found, do not seek him. He heard too much and left part of himself in the sound. It is no longer just his music. It is his grief, his madness, his longing. Silence it, or you will follow. Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me without a word. Do you think it's true? I asked. That a man could leave part of himself inside music? Emotion can saturate an act, Watson, Holmes said softly. Much like intention can linger in a room where great decisions were made. This tone, it was not just engineered, it was felt. That's why it was so dangerous, not because it was heard, but because it resonated. We locked the suitcase in Lionel's study, the keys taken and placed in the solicitor's custody under Holmes's instruction. The materials from the chamber were sealed in wax paper bundles and packed to be sent to the British Museum under restricted classification, should any future scholar wish to examine them under better controlled conditions. By the time we left the estate, the sky had begun to pale with the earliest breath of morning. The carriage waited on the gravel drive, our bags stowed and the suitcase left behind at last. As we boarded, I turned once more to look at the house. Its sharp gables now seemed less ominous in the gray dawn. No sound came from it, no hum, no whisper, only the distant caw of a rook overhead. Holmes sat beside me and lit a cigarette. You saw her, didn't you? I asked at last, unable to keep the thought contained. Beatrice. In the mist. I saw something, Holmes replied. A figure, a suggestion. Whether it was truly her or the tone's final grasp upon our minds, I cannot say. But I believe she is alive. Alive, he nodded. Somewhere on the edge of suggestion and sanity. She may have been drawn away, not by force, but by the internal pull of an influence she could not name. If she's found, I believe she'll return to herself. especially now that the source is gone. We rode in silence for several minutes more. Then I said, "There was a moment in that chamber when the hum stopped. I felt a weight lift, but in that absence, there was something else. A sadness." Holmes exhaled smoke through his nose. "Yes, not all echoes are sinister, Watson. Some are simply unresolved." He leaned back against the cushions of the carriage, eyes half closed. This case, for all its strangeness, was not about crime in the conventional sense. There was no murder, no theft, and yet harm was done, because something human was left too long unheard. And that, I realized, was the final truth of the case. That the silence inside the suitcase had not been empty after all. It had held not just sound, but memory, emotion, a man's descent into obsession, a woman's long vigil of containment, and perhaps redemption in the act of ending the note before it played too long. As London's skyline rose in the distance, Holmes tapped his fingers against the side of the carriage in a soft, steady rhythm. 4 beats, then silence. "Watson," he said, eyes still closed, "do you know what I think?" "What?" "That it was not the suitcase which was haunted. It was the sound." And with that, he said no more. The ride back to London passed in an uneasy quiet. Holmes did not sleep, nor did he speak much beyond the occasional idle observation about passing stations or the mist that seemed to cling to the countryside long after dawn. I occupied myself by reviewing my notes from the past days, though I found them difficult to concentrate on. My mind returned, again and again, to the chamber beneath the Deering house, and that impossible sound that had worked upon the senses like a whisper of madness. It was late afternoon by the time we arrived back at Baker Street. The fire had been lit in our absence, and Mrs. Hudson had left a pot of tea warming on the sideboard. Holmes sank into his armchair with the air of a man returning from some distant mental voyage. "We will hear from Cornwall again," he said, stretching out his legs. "You believe Beatrice Tilling will be found?" "Not immediately. But now that the tone has been silenced, the influence severed, whatever compulsion drove her from herself will diminish. It is only a matter of time before someone recognizes her or she finds her own way back. There's a strange resilience in the mind, Watson. When freed from pressure, it seeks to right itself." I poured the tea. "You think she simply wandered off? Entranced by a vibration?" Holmes gave a dry smile. "People are more susceptible to suggestion than most will admit. If you combine the right pitch with a subtle rhythm and repeat it long enough, you could coax a man to leap from a tower, or convince a young maid she is being called somewhere unseen. I do not believe Miss Tilling is beyond reach. Merely lost within herself." He took the cup I handed him and sat for a time in silence, sipping slowly. Then, as though brushing aside cobwebs, he rose and crossed to his desk, where he retrieved the folio containing the sheet music from the chamber. "I sent a telegraph to Professor Moriarty's former colleague, Emil Dreschner, the acoustic physicist, before we left Cornwall. He has done experiments in subauditory resonance. If anyone can interpret the structure of this notation, it is he." "Do you suspect Moriarty was involved?" I asked, surprised. Holmes shook his head. "Not directly, but his school of thought, order through control, manipulation through science, echoes here. What interests me more is the fact that the musical structure itself was not random. It was deliberate. Whether composed by accident or intention, it mimicked tonal constructs found in certain temple rituals, Tibetan gongs, monastic drones, all aimed at deep, unconscious suggestion. And yet the music was just one element," I said. "The suitcase, the chamber, the silence." Holmes turned back to the fire, thoughtful. "Yes, the silence, Watson. We keep returning to it." Lady Margaret understood instinctively that it was not the sound that endangered. It was the way silence was used to conceal its presence. Imagine living above such a place for decades, feeling something you cannot name, a pressure in the walls. She must have been perpetually alert. She did more than contain it, I added. She warned Lionel, in her will, her diary, and she made it hard to access. She tried to put a bell around a ghost, Holmes said, and succeeded better than most. Just then, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it, scanned the contents, and passed it to me without a word. Found, young woman, matching description, Falmouth, disoriented. Responding to name Beatrice. Request instructions. My heart leapt. She's alive. Holmes only nodded. As expected. She must be brought back to London. She'll need medical care, evaluation. Holmes held up a hand. Number, not yet. She must recover in her own time and in her own place. Send instructions that she is to remain in Falmouth under quiet supervision. No interference. No questions. I stared at him. You think pressure might drive her further from herself? I think that whatever she heard lingers faintly, like smoke after a fire, but without the source, it will fade. I moved to write the reply, and Holmes returned once more to the folio. He held up one of the pages and turned it toward the firelight. You see this passage? He asked, tapping a bar of notation near the bottom. The pattern shifts here, abruptly. 4 notes, identical in duration, spaced at uniform intervals. I see it. What of it? It's not part of the rest. It's a marker, possibly a signature. A composer's cipher? Perhaps. Or a code. He crossed to his shelf, removed a thin monograph on cryptographic music systems, and began cross-referencing. While Holmes immersed himself, I reflected once more on the strangeness of the case, a suitcase that emitted silence, a woman who vanished not out of fear, but by a kind of invitation, a resonance that left no bruises, only confusion. There had been no true villain here, only danger born of discovery and a failure to understand its consequences. Holmes often said the universe operated on knowable laws, but this case had flirted with the unknowable, and still in the end, he had explained it. After an hour, Holmes snapped the book shut. I've found it. I looked up. The signature. Yes, it's a variant on a method used by a 19th-century music theorist named Jolivet. He believed emotional content in music could be mathematically encoded. Holmes laid the music sheet on the table and pointed. These 4 notes correspond to a numerical pattern, 7-4-2-3. And Lady Margaret's brother, Giles Deering, born July 4th, 1842, died, allegedly, March 3rd, 1863. My eyes widened. You think he faked his death? I think he disappeared, perhaps deliberately, perhaps under duress. But not dead. Not then. He may have returned later. That music was written by someone who lived through more than adolescent experimentation. It contains structure, refinement, and pain. Holmes rolled the folio back into its leather sheath. And now, he said, the case is closed. I raised an eyebrow. Is it? Yes, Watson. The tone is silenced, the influence ended. The girl will recover. Whatever man created that sound is long gone. His music, though once dangerous, is now just ink on paper. He stood, stretched his arms, and looked toward the evening sky through the window. Still, I wonder what other echoes might be hidden in the world. How many quiet dangers hum just beneath the threshold of perception? Shall I write the account? I asked. Holmes considered. Write it, yes? But delay its publication. Let this case sleep for a while, undisturbed. The world is not yet ready to believe a man could disappear into a single sustained note. He smiled faintly and turned away, the firelight catching the sharp angle of his cheekbones. And in that room, though all was quiet, I could almost hear the last of the hum, fading into memory. The following days passed quietly in Baker Street. Holmes, when not engaged in brief correspondence with Falmouth or awaiting word from Dreschner regarding the musical cipher, resumed his typical idiosyncratic routines, scraping away at his violin, reading 3 newspapers at once, or lying fully clothed upon the divan, unmoving for hours. I attempted to distract myself with the more ordinary rhythms of practice and errands, but my mind remained anchored to Cornwall, to the suitcase, and most of all, to the strange and haunting influence of sound that had so nearly eluded explanation. It was on the 4th morning after our return that the post arrived bearing a single envelope, unremarkable in appearance, but with a return address stamped Imperial College of Science, Kensington. Holmes opened it without ceremony, and a slip of paper fell into his lap. He read it once, then again, and then handed it to me without comment. The notation fragment aligns precisely with experimental resonance triggers observed during harmonic threshold studies. Particularly troubling is the consistency of the 64 Hz sequence. This is not mere art. It is targeted design. Your instincts were correct. The structure is not incidental. It is, dare I say, weaponized. Kindly destroy the manuscript if it has not yet been filed. The danger lies not in performance, but in replication. Dreschner. I looked up from the note. He believes it was meant to induce a specific response. Not just any response, Holmes said quietly. A change in perception, a manipulation of attention. Imagine a note that causes the mind to focus inward, endlessly circling the suggestion it plants. A hypnotic loop without the theater of hypnosis. Then it was not just Giles Deering's madness, I said. It was his intent. Holmes nodded. That's the conclusion Dreschner draws, and one I had already begun to suspect. The cipher wasn't only biographical. It was a signature, yes, but also a key. A proof that the piece was designed to do something. And yet the original composition was never fully played. Lady Margaret ensured that. She interrupted the pattern, which brings us to the present. He gestured toward the folio still locked in his drawer. The question now is not what to do with it. It's why it ever came into being at all. A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card on a silver tray. Holmes took it and read it, eyebrows rising in mild surprise. Well, he said, it appears the consequences of silence are not done with us yet. The visitor was a tall, gaunt man of about 50, plainly but meticulously dressed. His eyes, pale and distant, seemed to scan the room as though noting dimensions, not objects. Holmes motioned him to a seat without introduction. You are Mr. Felix Carrow, Holmes said, of the Royal Society of Musical Theory. The man inclined his head. I am. I have come on the recommendation of Professor Dreschner. He wrote to me regarding a certain pattern found in a set of anonymous compositions recovered by you during a recent investigation. Recovered and contained, Holmes said. Their origin is private. I understand, Carrow replied. But you must also understand, Mr. Holmes, that these compositions bear resemblance to a theory long buried and thought discredited. A theory I have spent 2 decades privately exploring. Holmes's eyes glinted. You believe in acoustic suggestion? I do. And more than that, I believe Giles Deering may not have been the only one to stumble upon it. He may only have been the first. That drew silence from even Holmes. Carrow leaned forward. There are other fragments, in monasteries, in certain Arabic treatises, even one etched into the margin of a Rosicrucian manuscript held in Vienna. They all follow the same principle, sound frequencies structured not to be heard as music, but to be felt in the mind. Holmes considered this gravely. And why come now? Because I have heard a similar note. Recently. Not in Cornwall, but in London. Where? At an exhibition, 3 weeks ago, a gallery at Montague Place, an avant-garde piece billed as The Architecture of Sound. Holmes sat up. Did others hear it? No one said they did, but I watched their faces. I watched them pause as though something had caught them briefly from inside. Then they moved on. Most shook their heads. One woman left in tears, without understanding why. Holmes stood and walked to the fireplace, his back to us. The pattern's been replicated. I believe so. And not by accident, Holmes murmured. Number, not by accident. We said little else. Caro took his leave soon after, and the silence that returned was colder than any I had felt since Cornwall. Holmes stood motionless, then said softly, "This case was never confined to Deering's chamber, Watson." That was merely the first echo. Someone, perhaps unknowingly, has found a fragment of the pattern and begun to disseminate it. You mean to say the influence could spread? I mean to say, Holmes replied, that music has always been a form of transmission. Most use it to share beauty. But what if someone used it to spread influence? He turned to me, his face as grim as I'd ever seen it. We have silenced one suitcase, but we have not silenced the idea. The next morning we went to the Montague Place Gallery. It had already closed. The exhibition had been taken down ahead of schedule, citing technical difficulties and an inexplicable resonance affecting certain materials. Holmes said nothing to the attendants, only noted the names of the curators and requested a catalogue of the installation, which he studied that evening with intense scrutiny. "Do you see this?" he asked, pointing to a diagram of a central chamber from the exhibit. Octagonal layout, steel frame, elevated platform. Beneath it, a subwoofer system designed to produce felt sound rather than audible music. I read the caption. They called it "The Tension of Stillness." Holmes laughed darkly. They don't even know what they built. Do you think it's the same frequency? We'll find out. If not this one, then the next. Sound leaves no fingerprints, but it leaves a pattern, and someone is following it. I stood, suddenly chilled despite the warmth of the room. Then this is far from over. Holmes's voice dropped to a near whisper. No, Watson. The note may have stopped in Cornwall, but the silence it left behind has been filled, not with peace, but with imitation. And in that moment, as the fog curled once more outside our window, I realized the case of the silence inside the suitcase had not ended. It had only begun to be heard. The following day dawned with leaden skies and a damp wind curling through the streets like the city itself had taken a long, unsteady breath. Holmes spent the morning pacing the sitting room with increasing restlessness. The catalogue from Montague Place lay open on the table, surrounded by fragments of sheet music, a chart of frequencies, and a fresh sheaf of notepaper already filled with looping annotations in Holmes's precise hand. I dared not interrupt him while he worked through his chain of deductions, but I could see he was bothered. It was not the disorder of the gallery's closure, nor the mysterious resonance Caro had described. It was the pattern Holmes sensed emerging behind it all. His genius did not merely operate in the immediate. He possessed an uncanny instinct for future consequence, and what he feared now was not a single misused invention, but a replication. It was just after midday when the first real break came. A telegram arrived from Falmouth. Tilling recovering. Memory fragmentary but improving. Has spoken of the note in the walls and a room without echo. Appears unaware of disappearance. Requests news of Lady Margaret. Holmes read it 3 times, folded it carefully, then tapped it against his open palm. The room without echo, he murmured. That phrasing again. She remembers the psychological impact, not the experience itself. And she still thinks Lady Margaret is alive, which suggests her mind fractured around the moment of influence, Holmes said. Not from fear, from dissonance. The sound overwhelmed her perceptual faculties, but she retained the impression, like heat after flame. And now, I asked, if she's recovering, what does it mean for the rest of us? Holmes gave a thin smile. That we are not immune. He rose and crossed to the window, watching the fog move sluggishly over Baker Street. If the tone is spreading, if someone, somewhere, has reconstructed even a part of it, then it could begin to appear in places not as music, but as atmosphere. In lecture halls, in public installations, in political rallies. Surely you don't think this will become widespread? Holmes turned. Watson, ideas spread faster than disease. This is not about performance. It is about knowledge. What Giles Deering discovered has passed into the wild, and someone, perhaps without understanding, is toying with it. He paused, then nodded toward the door. Come, we must pay a visit. To whom? The last name on the Montague Place catalogue. A man by the name of Ethan Vexley, the supposed curator of the exhibit. The address led us to Clerkenwell, a lean, brick-fronted studio tucked behind an alley thick with the acrid scent of paint and rust. Vexley's door bore no name, only a copper knocker in the shape of an abstract ear. Holmes tapped it once. We heard motion inside, a scrape of furniture, a pause. Then the door opened. Vexley stood before us, a man of no more than 30, with a narrow frame and black hair that hung like a veil across his face. His eyes, sharp and hollow, fixed on Holmes as if measuring him. "You're not collectors," he said flatly. "No," Holmes replied. "We are investigators." "Police?" "Not quite. May we come in?" Vexley hesitated, then stepped aside. The interior was what I had come to expect from the modern art world. Unfinished canvases, twisted metal, sound equipment wired through walls in what could only be described as a deliberate maze of intention. But the centerpiece was unmistakable. A low platform at the room's center, surrounded by 8 metal poles. Holmes moved toward it immediately. "This was your installation?" "Yes," Vexley said, watching him. The tension of stillness. Inspired by the notion of passive resonance, I studied temple architecture, cathedrals, stone circles. "And where," Holmes asked, "did you first encounter the idea of a resonant pattern based on 64 Hertz? Vexley blinked. "I didn't. I arrived at it through harmonic layering." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And how did you determine the layering intervals?" Vexley frowned, defensive now. "I didn't invent the formula. It was part of a monograph I found years ago, pages from an unsigned work. I thought it was theoretical, symbolic even. I built the chamber to see, not to cause anything." Holmes stepped closer. "Do you still have the monograph?" Vexley hesitated, then crossed the room to a drawer and retrieved a thin, yellowed sheaf of papers. Holmes took them without ceremony and spread them across a nearby table. I looked over his shoulder. The pages were filled with handwritten equations, musical bars, circular diagrams with annotations in Greek and Latin, and at the corner of the final page, an unmistakable insignia. Holmes tapped it. There, Deering's cipher, but stylized. Vexley leaned in. I always assumed it was the composer's mark. "It is," Holmes said grimly, "but the composer died over 40 years ago." Vexley took a step back, visibly unsettled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you replicated a mechanism you never understood, and in doing so, activated an effect that was designed to bypass conscious analysis. You created an environment that produced suggestion without message, influence without direction. But I didn't tell anyone what to feel," Vexley said. Holmes fixed him with a hard stare. "You didn't have to?" We left shortly after, the monograph now in Holmes's possession. As we returned to Baker Street, he was quieter than usual, his thoughts clearly reaching far beyond the day's revelations. "This is how it begins," he said at last. "A fragment passed hand to hand, a theory published and forgotten, until one curious man, one artist, one student tests it and finds the silence beneath the sound. You believe there will be more? I know there will." That evening, as I watched him sort through the notes and Dresden's analysis, it became clear Holmes had shifted from solving a case to guarding against something larger, a knowledge he could not yet extinguish, only contain. The tone was gone, but the pattern remained. Replication had already begun, not through intent, but through resonance. One man had heard it in Cornwall, another had rebuilt it in London, and somewhere, perhaps already humming beneath a floorboard or vibrating in a closed gallery, the note continued. It would not announce itself loudly. It never had, but Holmes would be listening. The storm broke in the early hours of the following morning. Wind lashed against the windows of Baker Street, and rain drummed on the rooftops with a ceaseless persistence, as though the city itself was trying to drown out a sound only it could hear. I rose to find Holmes already at the window, pipe in hand, his silhouette backlit by grey dawn. He had not slept, that much was clear. The folio, the monograph, and the fragment from Deering's chamber were arrayed before the fireplace in careful order, as if under silent interrogation. "You've found something," I said, pouring tea. Holmes didn't move. "Not found." Confirmed he turned, eyes sharper than they had been in days. "Watson, the monograph Vexley used, Deering didn't write it alone. I recognize the structural signature. There's another hand in this." I paused mid-pour. "Another composer." Holmes stepped to the folio and withdrew the final sheet, the one bearing the stylized cipher. "This insignia has been embellished, but the geometry, 12-point star within an octave spiral, was favored by a certain school of harmonic theorists in the 1850s. Not British. Austrian, the Vienna link," I said. "You mentioned a Rosicrucian manuscript." "Exactly. Deering may have discovered the principle independently, but someone else helped refine it, structured it into a repeatable form, and that someone left traces." He opened a small case and pulled out a telegram draft he'd already composed. "To a librarian at the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek. I've asked for references to harmonic transmission theories in pre-1870 private publications. Particularly anything connected to a name I found marginally penciled at the edge of Vexley's monograph. Ritter, you think Ritter was the second architect?" "I think Ritter was the key that turned Deering's madness into method." The telegram was sent before breakfast. By noon, a reply had arrived, fast considering the distance. Ritter Johann Michael, archived under unorthodox acoustical phenomena, referenced in Verlust der Stille, 1864. One surviving copy held in Rare Works Room, unavailable for loan. Composer, occultist, disappeared, 1866. Holmes looked up from the telegram slowly. "Disappeared," I echoed, "like Deering." "And in the same decade." Holmes tapped the edge of the page. "What's more intriguing is the title, Verlust der Stille, the loss of silence. It's a warning disguised as theory." A knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson stepped in, holding a second telegram, this one with the seal of the Falmouth Constabulary. Holmes took it and read it aloud. "Tilling reported missing again. Vanished from supervision during walk. Shoe prints lead to Sea Cliff. No sign of struggle. Left note." I hear it again. We stared at one another in stunned silence. "Then it's not over," I said at last. "Even after disabling the chamber." Holmes dropped into his chair, steepling his fingers. "Number." The sound wasn't just physical. It planted something. The girl, fragile as she was, must have retained the pattern, perhaps in memory, perhaps in the body itself, like an infection. I felt a cold sweat bloom across my neck. "Then it can spread from person to person?" "Not easily," Holmes replied. "But under the right conditions, yes, through suggestion, through repetition, through art or storytelling, even through a well-placed phrase." He turned to me with a rare gravity. "You must understand, Watson, This is not about solving a crime anymore. It's about preventing one. A larger one. I nodded, slowly. You think someone is already working to continue Deering and Ritter's efforts? I do. But they no longer operate in basements and locked rooms. Now they use galleries, recordings, spaces filled with the curious and unsuspecting. Holmes stood and began pacing again, pausing only to light his pipe. The flame from the match illuminated his features starkly, and for the briefest instant I saw something in his expression I rarely did. Weariness. There is one last place I must visit, he said. A private collection near Hampstead. Caro mentioned it once in passing, a man named Thwaite. An eccentric collector of obscure scores and sonic devices. I believe he may have acquired fragments of Ritter's later work. I'll come with you. No, Holmes said firmly. Not this time. If I am correct, this visit may not be safe. These are not men who work openly, and I cannot risk your presence being used against me. Despite my protest, I knew better than to argue when Holmes had reached such conviction. I watched as he packed the relevant materials, the monograph, Dreschner's letter, Deering's cipher, and slipped out into the wet grey afternoon. He did not return by dusk, nor by midnight. By 2 a.m, I was pacing the very floor he had worn down with his own footsteps. The rain had stopped, the wind had stilled, and the silence in Baker Street felt heavier than it had since the day the suitcase arrived. Then, at 3:30, the bell rang. I opened the door to find Holmes pale, damp and shaken in a way I had never seen him. Inside, he said simply. He sat in his chair, wordless for a time, then said quietly, there were others. In the house. Thwaite is not merely a collector. He's a practitioner. I heard it, Watson. The tone. They've rebuilt it. They call it the Choir of Dust. It is played through steel pipes that span the house, masked as heating, but it's not heat they're moving, it's resonance. Did they see you? I made my presence known. I left before the full demonstration, but not before they began speaking of their intentions. He leaned forward, eyes blazing. They believe silence is the enemy, Watson. That sound, structured, layered sound, can be used to control perception, to rewrite emotion. They speak not in terms of music, but architecture, governance. And they are testing it now, not in hidden rooms, but in the world. He removed a thin metal disc from his pocket. A recording, hidden in one of Thwaite's books. It contains part of the pattern. We must destroy it. We will, Holmes said. But not yet. First, we must understand it. Because this is no longer an echo of a madman's music. It is an ideology, and it is growing. He rose and placed the disc in a locked drawer, then looked out at the sleeping city. They have learned how to speak without words, he said, and we must learn how to hear them. In that moment, I realized we had stepped far beyond any ordinary case. We had entered a war not of bullets or blades, but of influence, of tones no one could name, shaping thoughts no one realized weren't their own. And Holmes, ever the rationalist, would now do battle not with a criminal, but with a frequency. The following weeks passed in a kind of focused dread. Holmes became consumed, not with urgency, but with a cold, methodical resolve. Each morning he studied the disc recovered from Thwaite's house, never playing it in full, only examining its waveforms and frequencies through analog instruments and acoustic filters he built from scratch. Our sitting room became less a place of rest and more a laboratory of tension. He forbade even a second's exposure to the core recording. The danger lies in repetition, he warned. A tone may be harmless in one ear and catastrophic in another. It is not the sound alone, but the mind it meets. He sent letters, coded, anonymous, across Europe. To archivists, former correspondents, Dresden, and even the British Museum's inner circle. Whatever he sought, it was beyond the reach of Scotland Yard or the law. Holmes, in this final phase, was hunting not a criminal, but a principle, the principle of influence unchecked. Then, one evening, he sat back from his desk, his eyes glassy but victorious. "It is finished," he said. "You've neutralized the sound. Number that would be too presumptive. But I have inverted it. Think of it like light and shadow, Watson. If the choir of dust is structured to draw the mind inward, unmoor it from certainty, then this response I've created pulls the mind outward again. It restores framing. It returns anchorage." He held up a fresh disc. It bore no inscription, only a red thread woven through a small hole at its center. "I've embedded this counter-frequency into a short orchestral piece, ordinary to the ear. A minuet, nothing more. But layered beneath it is the anti-pattern, the unbinding key." "And now?" "Now," Holmes said, rising, "we deliver it." We returned to the Hampstead house under cover of night. Holmes had arranged for Lestrade, briefed under strict confidence, to monitor the exterior with 2 trusted constables. No arrests, no confrontation, simply containment. Silence, this time, was our ally. Inside, the house was dark, not abandoned, but asleep. A deep, unnatural sleep. Holmes moved without sound through the library, where the pipes ran like veins along the ceiling. We passed a door through which I heard faint breathing, a kind of chanting, wordless, droning, the choir of dust. Holmes located the central control, a brass plate phonograph rigged to steel tubing beneath a velvet cloth, and removed the current disc with surgical care. He placed his own in its stead and lowered the needle. There was no music. Not at first. Then, slowly, the air changed. Not with tone, but with absence. As if the pressure had lifted. The chanting beyond the door faltered, then stopped. Holmes waited. 10 minutes passed, then footsteps. We ducked behind the shelves. The door opened. A figure stepped out. Thwaite, bleary-eyed, disoriented. Behind him others emerged, men and women in ordinary clothes, their faces blank with confusion. Holmes stepped out first. "Mr. Thwaite," he said calmly. Thwaite blinked. "I know you. You were here before, but that music, it's gone." "Yes," Holmes replied, "and what remains is your own thought. Take care with it." 3 days later, Thwaite's house was vacated. The apparatus dismantled piece by piece. The recordings confiscated and placed under classified lock in the British Museum's vaults. Not destroyed, but hidden away from curious hands. Beatrice Tilling was found again, wandering near a chapel in Kent, humming. But the tune she carried was not the tone. It was the minuet, the counter-pattern Holmes had embedded. The restoration had begun, however quiet. In the quiet weeks that followed, Holmes returned at last to his violin. Not to experiment, but to play. "Do you think it's truly over?" I asked one night as the fire cracked and he drew the bow across the strings. "Nothing is ever truly over, Watson, but balance can be restored, and for now, that is enough." I watched him then, not as a friend or chronicler, but as a man who had stared into the void of influence and walked back with his reason intact. "There will be others," I said. He nodded. "Yes, but we've given the world a defense. Not a weapon, an answer. And when the note returns, we will hear it." Holmes smiled faintly. "No," he said, "they will." And so the case of the silence inside the suitcase ended, not with a revelation of a single villain, but with the safeguarding of human thought itself. In a world growing louder, more connected, more susceptible, Holmes had carved out a moment of quiet clarity. A silence not of absence, but of understanding, 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 but of understanding.